She was 21 and, for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family left to speak of, no prospects, and a final settlement of £50 clutched in a small leather purse. And with a fraction of that sum, she bought the worthless old forest house in the village of Fern Hollow, a place no one had lived in for 40 years. But what the mocking villagers and the dismissive solicitor did not know was that behind a damp and crumbling cellar wall was a secret that would not only change her life, but would make her the most respected woman in the Shire. Settle in close, and let us know in the comments where you are watching this story from tonight. Charlotte Reeves had learned the shape of the world through its textures and its scents. She was not a daughter of the main house, but a shadow within it, an orphaned niece, taken in by her uncle, Sir Alistair Reeves, after a fever had claimed both her parents when she was just 4 years old. Her world was not the polished mahogany of the dining room or the soft velvets of the parlor, but the cool, worn stone of the scullery floor, the sharp, clean scent of lye soap, the earthy smell of potatoes fresh from the ground, and the complex perfume of the herb garden. Her mentor, and indeed her truest mother, was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper at Blackwood Manor. Mrs. Gable was a woman built of quiet competence and wiry strength, with hands that were never still and a gaze that saw straight to the heart of a thing, whether it was a stubborn stain on linen or a hidden sorrow in a young girl's eyes. It was Mrs. Gable who taught Charlotte the language of plants, how to coax lavender from tight buds, how to dry mint and chamomile in the warm, still air of the attic, and how to make a poultice of comfrey that could soothe a deep bruise. She learned to read the seasons not by the calendar, but by the state of the garden, and she learned to measure wealth not in coin, but in full jars of preserved damsons and neatly tied bundles of thyme. Her only true possession, the single object that was entirely her own, was a small, thin silver locket her mother had worn. Inside, it held a tiny, faded lock of her mother's brown hair, a silent testament to a love she could barely remember, but felt as a constant, gentle warmth against her skin. This locket, and the skills Mrs. Gable had given her, were the whole of her inheritance. She understood work, the steady rhythm of it, the honesty of a task done well, and she understood the quiet dignity of self-reliance. When her uncle, Sir Alistair, passed away from a sudden affliction of the heart, the world of Blackwood Manor shifted on its axis. His new wife of only 2 years, Lady Isabel, a woman with a face as sharp and cold as a winter frost, saw Charlotte not as a grieving niece, but as a loose thread in the tapestry of her new life, a thread she intended to snip. Charlotte knew, with the certainty of a coming frost, that her time as a shadow in the great house was coming to an end. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and bloodless as an execution on paper. There was no shouting, no dramatic casting out into the rain. There was only the solicitor's office in the nearby town, a room that smelled of dry paper, old leather, and the faint, sour scent of stale pipe smoke. Mr. Davies, a man whose face seemed made of pale, soft dough, sat behind a desk of imposing dark wood. Lady Isabel was not present. She had dispatched her will through this man, preferring the clean, administrative cruelty of the law to the messiness of a personal dismissal. Charlotte sat opposite him, her back straight in the hard wooden chair, her hands folded over the small purse in her lap. She wore her best dress, a simple gray wool that Mrs. Gable had helped her alter, and she felt the familiar weight of her mother's locket against her collarbone. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, a dry, rustling sound. He did not meet her eyes, focusing instead on a document that lay between them. "Miss Reeves," he began, his voice as dry as the papers he handled. "As you know, the estate of your late uncle, Sir Alistair Reeves, has now passed in its entirety to his widow, Lady Isabel Reeves. While you have no legal claim upon the estate, Lady Isabel, in her generosity, wishes to provide you with a final settlement to assist you in establishing a new life." He slid the paper across the desk. It was a simple document of release, stating that in exchange for the sum of £50, she relinquished any and all future claims. £50. It was the price of a good horse, or the annual wage of a senior housemaid. It was meant to be an ending, a neat and tidy sum to wash a lady's hands of an inconvenient relation. Charlotte read the words without expression. She did not plead or argue. To do so would be to give Lady Isabel a victory of emotion. And Charlotte had learned from Mrs. Gable that dignity was a shield to be held tightly in times of trial. She picked up the quill, dipped it into the inkwell, and signed her name in a clear, steady hand. Charlotte Reeves. Mr. Davies seemed to relax, the soft lines of his face sinking further into themselves. He counted out 50 sovereigns from a cash box, the gold coins making a cold, final sound as he stacked them on the polished wood. "You will be expected to have vacated your room at Blackwood Manor by tomorrow evening," he said, finally looking at her, his eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just professional disinterest. She simply nodded, gathered the coins into her purse, and stood. She walked out of the office and into the grey afternoon, the £50 feeling less like a beginning and more like the weight of a closing door. The journey was a slow unwinding of the familiar world. She left Blackwood Manor at dawn the next day, carrying a single carpet bag that held 2 changes of clothes, a small packet of bread and cheese, prepared by a tearful Mrs. Gable, and her precious locket. The housekeeper had pressed a worn leather-bound book into her hands at the last moment. "My mother's book of remedies," she had whispered, her voice thick. "It will serve you better than coin." Charlotte did not look back at the grand house as she walked down the long gravel drive for the last time. She caught the morning coach, paying the fare for a jarring, rattling ride that took her 20 miles away, to the edge of the Shire and the town of Oakhaven. There she learned of a property for sale in the nearby village of Fern Hollow, a place described by the clerk with a shrug as the old Greywood cottage, though it's hardly more than a ruin. The final part of the journey was on foot, a 3-mile walk along a muddy lane that narrowed as it wound deeper into the woods. The manicured fields and tidy stone walls of her uncle's lands gave way to something wilder. Ancient oaks, heavy with moss, leaned over the path, their branches tangling together to form a dense canopy that filtered the weak afternoon light into a shifting, dappled green. The air grew cooler and smelled of damp earth, of decaying leaves, and the sharp, resinous scent of pine. Her shoes, sturdy, but not made for such a trek, were soon coated in a thick layer of mud, and a persistent drizzle began to fall, clinging to her shawl and chilling her to the bone. She was tired, a deep weariness that went beyond the physical strain of the walk. It was the exhaustion of a life spent on the periphery, of holding herself perfectly still so as not to be a bother, and now, the profound fatigue of being utterly adrift. As she rounded a bend, she saw it. The village of Fern Hollow was a small collection of stone cottages, clustered around a squat church tower and a single public house, the Green Man, from which a plume of coal smoke rose into the damp air. It was a place that seemed to have grown directly from the earth, quiet and self-contained. The solicitor's office here was a small, cramped room above the baker's shop, and Mr. Finch was a thin, weaselly man with a perpetual sniff. He looked at her, a lone young woman with a single bag, and his assessment was swift and dismissive. "The Greywood place?" he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You don't want that, miss. Roof's half gone, gardens a wilderness, haunted, some say." But Charlotte had seen the photograph in the agent's window. She had seen the solid stone walls and the deep-set windows. She had seen potential where he saw only ruin. The acquisition was a transaction, marked by the solicitor's poorly concealed amusement and the exchange of £20, a sum that left her with £30, the book of remedies, and the locket. For this, she received a yellowed deed and a single, heavy iron key. Mr. Finch wished her good fortune with a tone that clearly implied she would need it, and the villagers she passed on her way out to the cottage watched her with open, unconcealed curiosity that bordered on pity. The cottage stood at the very edge of the village, where the lane dissolved into a forest track. It was set back from the path, half swallowed by a riot of overgrown ivy and tangled brambles. The name Greywood was apt. The stone of its walls was a deep, somber gray, streaked with green moss and dark with years of rain. The roof, made of heavy stone slates, sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, and a gaping hole on one side showed the dark ribs of the rafters beneath. The windows were blank with grime, and one on the ground floor was boarded up. A low stone wall that had once enclosed the garden had crumbled in several places, and the garden itself was a formidable jungle of nettles, briars, and shoulder-high weeds, with only the gnarled branches of an old apple tree visible above the chaos. Yet, Charlotte did not feel despair. She felt a strange sense of homecoming. This place, in its utter neglect, asked nothing of her. It did not require her to be quiet or invisible. It was a ruin, and so, in a way, was she. They could mend together. She fitted the heavy key into the lock of the thick oak door. It turned with a protesting screech of rusted iron, and the door swung inward on a single groaning hinge, opening into darkness and the thick, cold smell of damp stone, rot, and sleeping dust. She stepped inside, her bag dropping to the floor with a soft thud. Light struggled through the filthy windows, illuminating a scene of profound decay. The main room was floored with large, uneven flagstones. A vast hearth, black with soot, dominated one wall, a long dead fire laid within it. Cobwebs hung in thick, gray ropes from the ceiling beams, and a fine layer of dust and grime coated every surface. A rickety table and 2 chairs were the only furniture, one chair lying on its side with a broken leg. Through a doorway she could see a small, dark kitchen, with a stone sink and a rusted hand pump. A narrow, steep staircase led upwards to what she presumed were the bedrooms. It was bleak, but the bones of the house were good. The stone walls were immensely thick, the oak beams solid despite the cobwebs. It was a house built to endure. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her, that she could endure here too. The discovery began not with a map or a riddle, but with the practical and urgent need to address the damp. The smell was strongest from the cellar, a set of steep stone steps leading down from a trapdoor in the scullery. With a lit candle, casting flickering shadows, Charlotte descended into the cold subterranean space. The air was heavy and thick, smelling of wet earth and mildew. The cellar was small, with stone-lined walls and a floor of packed dirt. Barrels, long since fallen into staves, lay in one corner, and empty shelves, furry with mold, lined another wall. The dampness seemed to emanate from the far wall, the one that lay deepest into the hillside. It was darker than the others, slick with moisture, and the mortar between the stones was soft and crumbling to the touch. As she ran her hand over the cold, weeping surface, she noticed something odd. The stones were different here. While the other 3 walls were built of large, roughly hewn blocks of local gray stone, this wall was constructed of smaller, flatter field stones, fitted together with less skill. Tapping it with her knuckles produced a sound that was subtly different from the solid thud of the other walls. A hollow, resonant echo. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, pierced through her exhaustion. She retrieved a small hammer and a crowbar from the bag of tools she had purchased with her dwindling funds. The work was slow and arduous. The mortar, though soft, clung stubbornly. She worked by the light of a single lantern, the rhythmic chip-chip-chip of the hammer against stone, the only sound in the deep silence of the house. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her arms ached, but a growing sense of conviction drove her on. After an hour of patient labor, she managed to loosen the first stone. Prying it out with the crowbar, she was met not with damp earth, but with a void of perfect, dry darkness. A breath of cool, still air, free of the cellar's musty scent, washed over her face. Her heart began to beat a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She worked faster now, removing stone after stone, revealing a carefully constructed brick lining behind the false wall. It was a small, hidden alcove, no larger than a cupboard, that had been deliberately and skillfully sealed away. And there, resting on a low wooden shelf inside the dry, dark space, was a heavy, tin-plated deed box, its surface filmed with a light layer of dust, but otherwise untouched by the damp that had ruined the outer wall. Beside it lay a small, leather-bound journal. With trembling hands, she lifted the box out. It was heavy. far heavier than it should be for its size. Using the crowbar, she forced the simple lock. The lid sprang open with a soft metallic groan. Inside, nestled in what looked like yellowed linen, was not paper, but a sea of gold. Stacks of sovereigns, hundreds of them, packed tightly together, their milled edges gleaming in the lantern light. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, were several pieces of fine jewelry. A pearl necklace, a set of sapphire earrings, a heavy gold brooch, a fortune. But it was the journal that held the true meaning. She opened it, and on the first page, in a neat, elegant hand, a message was written. To whomever finds this place of safekeeping. My name is Alara Vance. I was a botanist and lived in this cottage for 22 years, until this spring of 1815. What is in the box is the whole of my savings, hidden from a grasping nephew who would see it squandered. If you have found it, it is because you have seen past the decay and have sought the foundation of things. Use it to build a good life within these walls, which I loved well. May this house be a shelter to you, as it was once to me. The rebuilding of Greywood Cottage began not with the gold, but with the roof. Charlotte knew that no amount of wealth could stop the rain from rotting the heart out of the house. She left the deed box hidden deep in the dry alcove, taking only 10 sovereigns with her. She walked into the village, her purpose settling the fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions. She sought out Mr. Silas Croft, the local slater, an elderly man with hands as gnarled as oak roots and a face weathered into a permanent map of skepticism. He listened to her request in the yard behind his workshop, surrounded by stacks of gray slate. The Greywood roof? He said, his voice a low rumble. That's not a repair, miss. That's a resurrection. Charlotte met his gaze without flinching. I will pay for the slate and for your time, Mr. Croft. I want it done properly. She laid 3 gold sovereigns on a nearby workbench. The old man's eyes widened slightly at the sight of real gold, not just promises. He picked one up, bit it, and then nodded slowly. I'll need a lad to help me, and it'll take the better part of a fortnight. He arrived 2 days later, with a young, strong-backed apprentice named Thomas Baird, and a cart laden with new slates. For the next 2 weeks, the quiet of the cottage was broken by the rhythmic tap of the slate hammer and the scrape of boots on ladders. Charlotte worked alongside them, not on the roof, but below, clearing the house, scrubbing the floors with lye and sand, and beginning the monumental task of taming the garden. She learned the language of their craft, the names of the tools, the difference between a headlap and a sidelap, the importance of the lathes. Thomas, who had initially shared the village's pitying view of her, began to watch her with a quiet respect as he saw her tireless, methodical work. While the men worked above, Charlotte turned her attention to the inside. She used Alara Vance's journal, which was filled not only with botanical drawings, but also with recipes for lime wash and natural wood polish. She made her own paint from slaked lime and water, and the dark, grimy walls of the main room were transformed into a soft, luminous white that seemed to gather and hold the light. She repaired the broken chair with wood glue and careful clamping. She unblocked the rusted pump in the scullery, working the handle for hours until, with a final groan of protest, it brought up a gush of clear, cold water from the well below. The community, at first watching from a distance, began to draw closer, one by one. Mrs. Hemlock, the village's formidable matriarch and gossip, appeared at the broken gate one afternoon, ostensibly to inspect the roof repairs. She peered at the neat rows of new slate, at Charlotte's dirt-smudged but determined face, and gave a curt nod. The next day, she returned with a basket containing a loaf of fresh bread, a crock of butter, and a half-dozen heirloom tomato seedlings. No sense in a garden full of nettles, was all she said. Mr. Evans, a farmer whose lands bordered the woods, stopped by with his 2 strong sons and spent a Saturday helping her clear the fallen branches and brambles from the yard, refusing any payment but a drink of cold well water. The rebuilding was a slow, deliberate process, a conversation between her labor, Ilara's knowledge, and the quiet, practical kindness of her new neighbors. The house, once a symbol of her folly, slowly transformed into a place of life and purpose. With the roof secure and the interior clean and bright, Charlotte began to truly inhabit Greywood Cottage. She used a small portion of the found money to purchase simple, sturdy furniture from a carpenter in Oakhaven, and a proper iron stove to replace the open hearth for cooking. The main room, with its whitewashed walls and the warm scent of drying herbs hanging from the beams, became a welcoming space. The fire, now contained within the new stove, burned brightly, casting a cheerful glow on the polished flagstones. Her days fell into a rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the house and garden. She rose with the sun, tending to the vegetable patch that was now thriving with Mrs. Hemlock's seedlings and other plants she had bought at the market. She spent hours in the surrounding woods, using Elara Vance's detailed journal as her guide. The book was more than a record of plants. It was a map to the hidden life of the forest. Charlotte learned to identify wild mushrooms, to find the best patches of bilberries, and to recognize the leaves of yarrow and plantain. She became a familiar sight on the forest paths, a solitary figure with a basket over her arm, her steps sure, and her gaze observant. The villagers' perception of her shifted. The poor, foolish girl who had bought the ruin was replaced by Miss Reeves from Greywood, a quiet, industrious woman who seemed to possess a deep and uncanny knowledge of the old ways. Women began to stop by her cottage, at first tentatively, to ask for a remedy for a child's cough or a salve for a burn. Charlotte, consulting Mrs. Gable's book and Elara's journal, would prepare a simple infusion of thyme and honey or a soothing calendula ointment. She never charged, but they would leave a few eggs, a jar of milk, or a piece of cured ham on her doorstep in return. Her small kitchen became an apothecary's workshop, filled with the scent of simmering herbs and beeswax. Thomas Baird, the slater's apprentice, became a regular visitor. He would stop by on his way home from work, often with a piece of scrap wood he thought she might find useful, or a bit of village news. He helped her build new shelves for her growing collection of jars and bottles, and he repaired the crumbling garden wall with a skill that impressed her. Their conversations were simple, rooted in the practicalities of their work, but a current of mutual respect and gentle affection flowed beneath the surface. She was no longer an outsider. She had a place. People knew her name, and her cottage was no longer the worthless old house, but simply Greywood, a place of healing and quiet strength. The mockery had faded, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine admiration. She had not set out to win their approval, only to build a life, but in doing so, she had become an essential part of the village fabric. Charlotte stood in the doorway of her kitchen, looking out at the garden. It was late afternoon in early autumn, and the low sun cast long shadows across the neat rows of kale and the last of the season's beans. The gnarled apple tree, which she had carefully pruned back to health, was heavy with fruit, its branches propped up with sturdy poles. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke from her chimney, and the sweet, earthy scent of fallen leaves. The cottage was warm and quiet behind her, a pot of vegetable soup simmering on the stove for her supper. In her hand, she held the small silver locket that had been her only link to her past. It felt smooth and cool in her palm. On the kitchen table, lying open, was Elara Vance's journal. Next to it sat a small, perfectly preserved pressed flower, a wild orchid, that she had taken from between its pages. She thought of Lady Isabel, back at Blackwood Manor, who had dismissed her with £50, believing she was casting her out into nothingness. She had meant for Charlotte to disappear, to become someone else's problem, a forgotten footnote in the Reeves family history. But that act of cold dismissal had been an act of liberation. It had untethered her from a life of being a dependent, a shadow, and had forced her to find her own foundation. The £50 had felt like an insult, a final valuation of her worth. But 20 of those pounds had bought her these stone walls, this garden, this forest. It had bought her the chance to uncover a forgotten history and a hidden legacy. Elara Vance's gold had given her the means to rebuild, but it was Elara's knowledge, combined with the skills Mrs. Gable had so patiently taught her, that had given her a purpose. She had become more than just the owner of Greywood Cottage. She was its steward, a continuation of the life of quiet work and deep connection to the land that Ilara had lived a generation before. She was not the richest woman in the Shire, in terms of land or title, but she was rich in ways that Lady Isabel could never comprehend. She was rich in self-reliance, in the respect of her community, and in the deep, quiet peace that came from building a life with her own two hands. Charlotte Reeves was 21 and had been cast out with almost nothing. She had £30 to her name after she bought the abandoned cottage on the edge of the woods. It was the best £20 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and hidden value. If you were moved by Charlotte's journey, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this story with someone who might appreciate it. It helps us to continue bringing these tales to you. And now we leave you with a question. What is the worthless thing in your own life that might hold a secret, waiting for you to look closer?